Hello, everyone. So, James, how are you?
All right.
So, let's talk a bit about Esprit. So, full disclosure, we, as Media Hub, we've been working with you. It started in April, right? From a global perspective, we've been doing activity primarily in Europe up until around September, where we've been helping you revamp and relaunch which was a phenomenal brand. I remember it very clearly. I don't look that old, but I'm old enough to remember. So we want to talk a little bit about that, about how your reintroduction into North America after being, I think, almost 20 years, right?
Yeah, 20 years.
So let's talk about that. So, Esprit is known for, tapping into some great designers, great photographers, in the 80s. How have y'all sort of evolved that approach as you reintroduce the brand for a more modern, newer consumer?
Yeah, so I think the thing to think about with Esprit is, look, I think there's lots of people in this room that probably remember it and have sort of quite fond memories about it. The way that, the brand was also built through, frankly, some sort of like quite iconic and powerful sort of like lenses. Olivier Toscani, who I'm sure many know through the work he did with Benetton, was quite a visceral sort of storyteller. And one of the things that we've wanted to do as time's moved on with the new brand is both reference what that is from a sort of an archive perspective, but then also be able to turn that into something that feels both new and dynamic for the rest of the marketplace. So the way that we're starting to think about the brand is less about sort of defined through one particular lens or one particular sort of like vision, but defined through a very clear principle about this idea of the rules don't apply. And when we apply this idea of the rules don't apply to Esprit, the world of Esprit sort of opens up. It becomes much more of a lifestyle, it becomes much more of a point of view on life. And how that then point of view starts to translate for us as we move into 2024 is starting to think of Esprit as much a fashion and sort of like retail brand, but really as almost like an IP. And think of it in a way that you can translate Esprit into different contexts, into different cultural ideas, into different lifestyles, with the same principle and the same spirit and the same energy that Toscani and John Casado and Doug Tompkins and Ettore Sotas brought to the brand back in the 80s and 90s.
So we're talking about a holistic approach, right?
Correct.
A holistic approach that is necessary to engage with consumers. Talk a bit about how you're translating that holistic approach, that curated approach, with what you're doing with pop-ups.
So the pop-ups, the way to think of then Esprit in the context of retail is, Europe is very much a sort of, the brand has been around for 30 plus years there. It has a very significant retail footprint, primarily based in sort of like Germany and France and Spain. The job that we have to do there is slightly different to what we're doing in North America. In North America, in the context of the pop-ups, it's a storytelling device for us, right? It allows us to the point I made about that IP, connect the past with a sort of modernity and a present, and allow people to sort of like experience the brand in both the nostalgia that they knew it, but equally in this way, in this new sort of like refresh sort of lens. So what we're doing and what we've been doing over the last sort of like 6 months or so is really sort of experimenting with that a little bit. We've been in LA, we've been in New York, and we're starting to sort of go into other markets now. We just opened in Chicago, which is an amazing store. We're opening in Miami. For anybody who's down in Florida, come visit us in November. We're very much sort of like looking at sort of how these spaces become a really great way to experience the brand. So the most recent example, and I was just in LA this weekend, was at the Grove. So the Grove, I think most people know, is incredibly busy. I think we were told it's the most Ubered destination in the world. There's 1 million trips that happen to the Grove every year. So it's a key destination for us to be part of. But one of the things we've done there, instead of it just being here's the clothes and here's a sort of like some really lovely VM, we've brought in a little bit more dynamism to it. So over the weekend, we actually had a whole series of events dedicated to denim. Esprit in the 1980s was one of the most innovative denim brands in the world. It took, you know, the heritage and history of Levi's and really sort of brought a new paradigm to it. And we wanted to explore that. We thought it was a valid thing for us to be able to talk about, to communicate, to almost like reveal this hidden history of this brand. And so one of the things we've started to do off the back of that is, you know, really lean into fan communities. So for us, you know, denim in Los Angeles is synonymous. They are completely and utterly, the industry is thriving there. There's a huge community. If you think of, you know, people that go to the Rose Bowl when they're buying their vintage, you know, all of the brands that exist out there. So we wanted to tap into that community. We worked with a bunch of sort of like curators and creators in that community, had some panels, we had some sort of like denim customization events. So we're just trying to bring different people into the brand and different communities. And what was lovely about it, when you're on the ground and you see people's reaction to it, you really understood how much emotion and heart people still have for the brand, which I think in the context of a turnaround is, you know, half the battle, right? We need that, we have a bit of a latent attention. So if we turn it on and we bring that sort of like love and devotion back a little bit to the brand, it allows us then, once we tap into these communities, to be able to sort of really drive that expertise and drive that storytelling. So pop-ups for us operate very much as something that is not just a store, but of a bit of a community gathering space. So
a curated approach to these pop-ups, which is very akin to out of home, right?
Yeah.
We're not just in high traffic areas, right? So how are you translating that curated approach to what you're doing from an out of home perspective?
Well, I think, you know, for us, you know, on a personal level, I have a real belief and like love for what out of home does, right? Maybe I'm playing to the crowd here, but the point is, for me, it is a beautiful, exquisite media. And it allows, certainly for fashion and retail brands, there's a reason why fashion brands, high fashion brands, if you think in Paris or wherever, keep coming back to out of home. Because if you are making that image, if you're telling that story, there's nothing better. So I think for us, what we wanted to do is, you know, the methodology, obviously working with your amazing team, is been bringing back that sort of like high impact. And then as we start to think about like the creators part of it, we want to bring a little bit more sort of like of the creator sort of like storytelling into sort of these contextual sort of moments. We want to make sure that there's some that people feel like there's a brand talking at the top, but there's also a you know, a community and an audience that sort of feels like it's coming to life in some of those out of home sort of like moments. So we're trying to sort of like play and experiment a little bit. And to that point of play and experimentation, the three principles of the new Esprit are playful, modern, and cool. And so the idea is always that we are coming back to that in both the tone and the way that we message, but also where we show up and how we message, and all of those different elements that really start to bring that sort of like media plan to life. And as I said at the beginning, as we start to think of how we sort of reimagine the brand as a little bit more of an IP, what that also then does, I think, from an out-of-home perspective, is it starts to use them in really, really interesting ways. Fragments. Think of breadcrumbs in a storytelling device. How you're bringing that person along, you know, from sort of like that one particular sort of like that teaser moment that draws you in, that little Easter egg that draws you into the next part of the story. And so that's how we are starting to think about the narrative in general about the brand. And equally, I think out of home then has a huge part of that.
And I think it works very well with the sometimes temporary nature of a pop-up, right?
Totally.
So this notion of build, 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 build. It's great, buzz, and then you know what? You missed it. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've been living on a plane for some time now. You're headed to Amsterdam next week. I'm sorry, but you know, hey,
it's not the worst place in the world.
C'est la vie.
That's Paris.
Yeah, I know. What has inspired you? You know, as you've been traveling. You know, again, just in sort of from a personal perspective, but also in terms of, you know, now in this role, you know, what out-of-home executions, what have you seen that's inspired you, or more so like you saw and you're like, shit, man, I wish we would have done that.
So I think I mean, it's funny. I go back to the brand sort of link. I was lucky that we had a couple of events at Paris Fashion Week, so we went and sort of did our thing. The beauty of going to Paris Fashion Week is multifaceted, but one of them is brands spend money, and they spend a lot of it, and they spend a lot of it on out of home. And so what you start to see is a sort of a methodology sort of come to life, as I said, about that brand elevation. But one of the things that, you know, and I really respect what, you know, Alexander Arnault is doing over at Tiffany. And Tiffany, you know, bought, and LVMH obviously in general has a methodology around buying big and buying expansive and really making sure that, you know, that you're using out of home as not just a sort of like a message driver, but a content driver as well. So they took over Opera and wrapped it. And it's a stunning piece of work. I mean, it literally, genuinely stops me in my tracks. And I was like, oh man, what if I had that budget? But, you know, it really...
I wish you had that budget.
Oh, no, that's a good point. Maybe next year. But, you know, I think it just is a testament to the role and that scale and that sense of sort of like a statement of intent. And I think that's you know, it was something that really sort of like stood out to me. And it got me thinking, you know, because I think the question was about, you know, other things that have stood out. You know, I might not look at these days, but I was in the streetwear and into sort of like, you know, in that sort of space for a while. And, you know, Supreme. Mm-hmm. You know, Supreme these days, let's be honest, it's gone off the boil a bit. But fundamentally, what Supreme did with their out-of-home, right, the tiny, like, wow posters, people would go crazy for them. I had the Neil Young one, and it was just like, you know, you would literally see people tearing it off the wall. And I was just like, that's a level of devotion and fandom that you want to sort of like get into. And I think the final one that sort of really stood out when you posed the question actually comes back a little bit to, I think in many ways, what Esprit can be, right? And it's the DKNY wall. I think it's a borderline sort of like, it's a gross sort of like misjudgment that doesn't exist in New York City, right? Think of every single like film from 1980s to the 2000s. That wall said something about New York, and it said it in 4 letters. It was Donna Karan, New York. Donna Karan doesn't exist anymore, pretty much as a brand, but that wall did, and it said something, I think, profound and meaningful about what people who dream of moving here, like I did 10 years ago, believe and think about in that brand. And that, I think, is then fundamentally the power of what that out-of-home can do.
So power of brand, so we're going to segue to sort of my curveball last question. Well, not necessarily curveball, it's a softball. Hasn't been in North America for over 20 years. Never left Europe, okay? Strong business in Germany, global brand. How are you translating that so that it feels the same, but yet is unique to the locale in which you exist?
Well, it comes back to those 3 principles, as I said: playful, modern, cool. They are the bedrock of how we operate as a new brand. The beauty of those ideas is they are somewhat contextual to the audience you're in. What is playful to the French and to the Dutch and to the Germans is not necessarily the same playfulness as it might be to America. So actually what that starts to give you is almost like these levers, and you can, or sort of like dials you can start to turn. And so I think that allows a brand to have real sort of flexibility. We're doing some work right now with a platform called Highsnobiety, which I'm sure a few people in this room know, and it's very much grounded in sort of like young consumer sort of like culture. And one of the things we're doing with them, again, is we're doing on a tour. We're going from, and I always get this wrong, so I'll get it right now, Amsterdam, Berlin, London, Paris, Copenhagen, and Madrid. 6 cities, 6 very different personalities. But in the context of those rooms and those cities, what we'll start to do is tell these stories in a different way. We'll tap into fan communities in a different way. We'll bring to life that sentiment of playful, modern, cool in a way that feels very contextual and local. And again, talks to the sort of like the relationship between the brand and the consumer in a little bit of a different way. And so fundamentally, when we have those 3 principles, the unifying thread that connects everything up is fun. When you remember Esprit, Whether you had a sweater, whether you had a t-shirt, whether you never bought it, whether you owned every single part of it, it was fun. And I think that is something that, for us, becomes this. It makes it feel like this sandbox and this playground that we want to be in.
Well, thank you, my friend. That's our time. I think we're maybe open up for questions. If there's any questions, thank you. Appreciate your partnership.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you very much.